Welcome to Chapter 11, Stereotyping, Prejudice, and Discrimination, part of the dark side of human behavior. Intergroup conflict is a complex social behavior. As such, there are probably multiple factors involved in initiating and maintaining it. Here we will discuss three of these. The economic perspective suggests that groups are in conflict over economic or material interest, and that this is what leads to their conflict. The motivational perspective looks at individual psychological needs as a basis for conflict. The cognitive perspective looks at intergroup conflict as a failure of the general tendency of humans to categorize people and items. Let's begin with definitions for three important terms. Stereotypes are beliefs about characteristics that are ubiquitous in a particular group. Prejudice, prejudging, is an emotionally based, negative or positive attitude towards a group because of these stereotypes. And discrimination is disparate treatment of individuals because of their membership in a particular group. Modern racism is the term given to prejudice that's directed at particular racial groups. This prejudice is subtle and under the surface and not explicitly expressed as it was in the past. Prejudice can be either negative or positive. When stereotypes result in benevolent prejudice, this means that a particular group, either racial, ethnic, gender, etc., will be seen as nicer, smarter, etc., all positive traits instead of seen in a negative way. This is still prejudice because it is a blanket descriptor applied to all members of the group. Prejudice is one of those characteristics that's difficult to measure because, for the most part, people don't want to be seen as prejudiced or biased against people because of their membership in a particular group. One attempt to get around this is what's known as the implicit association test, or IAT. This test works by measuring the difference in reaction times between instances in which outgroup pictures or words are linked with positive items and times when outgroup pictures or words are linked with negative items. If it takes longer to respond to the association between outgroup and positive items than with negative items, it is assumed to measure some unconscious or implicit bias. The results of tests that measure the relationship between IAT scores and actual behavior are not entirely consistent, but it does seem to, in some cases, predict who will be actually prejudiced in real life situations. Returning to our three theories of intergroup conflict, let's start with the economic perspective, which suggests that prejudice results from different groups competing over scarce resources. One example of the economic perspective is realistic group conflict theory, which holds that the more competition there is between groups for limited resources of whatever type, the more likely there is going to be prejudice and discrimination between those two groups. This was demonstrated in the Robbers Cave experiment conducted in 1954, so named because it took place at Robbers Cave State Park in Oklahoma. 22 fifth-grade boys were taken to the park. They had signed up for a 2.5-week summer camp that, unbeknownst to them, was also a study of intergroup relationship. The research team had spent over 300 hours screening boys from the Oklahoma City area to find 22 who were typical in many ways. None of them had any problems in school. All were from intact middle-class families, and there were no notable ethnic differences between them. The boys, none of whom knew each other beforehand, were divided into 2 groups of 11 and taken to separate areas of the park. Neither group knew of the other's existence, at least initially. In the first week, the 2 groups independently engaged in activities designed to foster group unity, such as preparing meals together and pitching their tents. They also took part in common camp activities like playing baseball, swimming, etc. Cohesion developed within each group. That is, the group members came to like each other. One group named themselves the Eagles, and the other group named themselves the Rattlers. In the second phase, the Eagles and Rattlers were brought together for a tournament. Each member of the winning team would receive a medal and a prize, in this case, a pocket knife, which in the 1950s was a pretty cool thing for a typical middle school boy to have. The losing team got nothing. During the competition week, the groups became quite hostile toward each other. They called each other names. The Eagles captured and burned the Rattlers' flag, which of course led to the Rattlers stealing the Eagles' flag. There were food fights, raids of each other's cabins, and possible physical fights would have broken out if the experimenters had not broken them up. The 2 groups were engaged in a competition for a scarce resource. That is, one group would get all the resources, the other group would get none. This led them to really not like each other very much at all, even though beforehand they had never even met. In order to decrease this hostility, the experimenters then engaged in another manipulation. They set up a number of situations in which all the boys would have to work together to meet a superordinate goal, that is, a goal that benefited everyone. In one instance, all the boys had to get together to tow the supply truck to the camp because it had broken down on the way. By the end of the experiment, the boys got along much better and even shared their money on the ride home. History is full of examples in which one group comes into conflict with another when there are a limited number of resources and there isn't enough for everybody to have what they want. Prejudice against immigrants always spikes when there is an economic crisis. That is, when jobs and resources are scarce, people tend to develop more prejudice to those who they see as coming into their group and taking their resources. Let's move on now to the second perspective, the motivational perspective. This is the idea that prejudice results from the natural tension between in-group and out-group. That is, we tend to see us as better than them. Even when groups are formed arbitrarily and randomly and placed in competition, people tend to see their group, the one they were randomly assigned to, as better than and more deserving than the other group. The most widely accepted theory about in-group preference is social identity theory, which suggests that our self-esteem, that is, our feelings about ourselves, comes not only from our personal identity and accomplishments, but also from the status and accomplishments of the various groups to which we belong. This may be why when your favorite sports team wins, we say, "We won." When they lose, we say, "They lost." This is called basking in reflected glory. Not only do we do that, but we also tend to defend our in-group against criticism as if it were criticism of us individually. Besides increasing our favoritism towards our group, another way to improve our relative position and our self-esteem is to denigrate the outgroup, to treat others as less than or less deserving than we are. Finally, we have the cognitive perspective, which focuses on what goes wrong when we rely overly on stereotypes. Stereotypes are schemas. They're cognitive shortcuts that allow us to come to decisions quicker and with less effort. In fact, one study found that we're more likely to use stereotypes when we're low in energy. Even though stereotypes are efficient uses of cognitive resources, they are often inaccurate. They tend to accentuate in-group similarities and out-group differences. That is, by not looking at people as individuals, we save time and energy, but we miss the differences among them. We call this out-group homogeneity. And because of this, when we see a single action by an out-group, we tend to assume that that behavior is typical of that group all the time. This can lead to self-fulfilling prophecies in which people encourage the very behavior that they expect. For example, we may expect members of a particular group to be aggressive toward us, so we engage in preemptive aggression against them, provoking the very response that we expected in the first place. When members of the outgroup do not engage in the stereotyped behavior, we often explain this away through a process called subtyping. One way in which stereotypes play out is the own race identification bias, the tendency that we all have to be better able to recognize and distinguish faces from our own rather than from other races. We all have two different systems that we use to navigate the world in our day-to-day existence. Mostly we use automatic processing, which is involuntary and unconscious, based on our feelings about things. If I decide I want to get a cup of coffee, it's because I feel like having one, not because I've engaged in a very complex, detailed analysis of whether I should or should not get one. Sometimes, though, we override this automatic processing with what is known as controlled processing, which is conscious, systematic, logical, and deliberate. A disturbing demonstration of automatic processing is a 2001 study by Keith Payne. Participants were shown either a photograph of a white face or a black face. They were then shown either a weapon or a tool. They were to identify the object they saw as either a weapon or tool as quickly as they could. The participants, all of whom were white, were quicker to recognize guns after seeing a black face and more likely to mistake a tool as a gun after seeing a black face, thereby demonstrating an automatic bias to associate black faces with weapons. In summary, stereotypes can alter our perception of and behavior toward groups that are identified as being outgroups or different from us. Stereotype threat, a concept developed by the psychologist Claude Steele at Stanford, is the fear of confirming stereotypes others have about one's group. Steele identified a number of instances in which people are nervous about and therefore perform worse on tasks that are associated with a stereotype that the dominant social group has about their group. For example, given a test of mathematics, male students perform better than female students. However, the same test, if it is labeled as a test of analytical ability, shows no gender differences in performance. Thus, the belief that, oh no, I'm going to demonstrate what everybody thinks about my group, can cause such anxiety as to interfere with actual performance. We all know that being anxious interferes with our ability to concentrate. In order to reduce stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination, a multimodal approach is necessary. Changes in broad social, economic, and legal institutions are one part of this. Another piece of the puzzle is for groups to engage in superordinate goals, as demonstrated with the Robbers Cave experiment. In order for this to work, the groups need to feel equal in status, to have a shared superordinate goal, and to have interactions on a one-to-one level. Research in this area continues. I hope this chapter has been interesting, informative, and thought-provoking for you, and I look forward to seeing you next week.